Hello everybody, Rook here, and today I've got a video on 60GP, the Polish Tier 10 Tech Tree Heavy Tank. Now, I've decided to do the 60GP mainly because of the new Tier 10 Premium BZYG, which features the new gun system. The same with the Polish tank destroyers that should be coming sometime soon. I don't know, Wargaming won't tell us. But anyway, for those of you who aren't very familiar with the 60GP, it's a very slow and sluggish heavy tank, but it has a 152mm gun, which naturally, with that 152mm, it has 750 alpha. But the caveat to that is that standard pen on AP is 250. Very low. Which means that you'll struggle to pen things generally with your standard rounds. A lot of times you'll have to switch to your heat rounds, which have only 317mm of pen. However, one of the bonuses to this is that your HE rounds have 90mm of pen, meaning that a lot of engine decks, a lot of turret roofs, those can all be overmatched but with your HE. So you have a very, very high alpha gun, but at the same time you also have 2600 HP, meaning you can tank shots when you need to, similar to the mouse, but not quite as well. So for the armor, on the turret you have anywhere between 170 and 260, frontally that is. The majority of your upper plate is 160mm, some parts of the side of the turret are 150mm, which decreases by 10mm as each armor panel you go backwards. The rear of the hull only has 90mm, so your HE might pen it, might not. It's a 50-50. But beside the tracks, you have 100mm of side armor, and do remember that tracks do count as spaced armor and will absorb heat shells. The upper sides, right above the tracks, range anywhere from 160mm to 110. Not to mention that they're both hyper-angled, meaning that it'll be very, very difficult for people to pen you when you're side scraping. Going back to the turret, your cupola in the front, if you're shooting it frontally, is 220mm, meaning that it can be very, very strong in certain situations. Now, something else that I need to mention is the ammo racks. So, there's one in the turret on the back left side, taking up a pretty big chunk of the back. You also have 4 medium-sized ammo rack blocks in the frontal sides, as well as the usual one down on the floor, while the fuel tanks in the engine take up a big chunk of the back of the hull, with fuel tanks being easily hittable through the rear sides. So if somebody shoots you in the back side, they'll likely go through both your fuel tank and your engine in one shot. Now onto the statistics. With the build that I have 2,348 DPM, a reload of just over 19 seconds, 0.39 accuracy, which is expected of such a large gun. Accuracy during movement is 2.43, so you're unlikely to hit anything on the move. Don't be playing this like a Leopard 1, with 0.73 for turret rotation, with the flexibility of 20 degrees of elevation and 8 degrees of depression. The 60GP goes 35 kilometers an hour maximum speed forward and 14 backwards, 780 horsepower and just under 13 power to weight, with a 12% chance for fire. Like I mentioned earlier, you have 2600 HP, which is pretty chunky for a heavy tank at tier 10. Your hull rotates at 27.74 degrees a second, which is slightly faster than the 22 straight degrees that your turret turns. Having such a large gun also comes with lots of module damage, which that means 203 on each shell. Your HE has a blast radius of 3.66 meters, and all your shells go at 900 meters per second. Now onto commander skills. So for the commander for my 60 TP, which I also used on the 50 TP, 53 TP, and 45 TP, I run Rapid Aim, Track Mechanic, Quick Learner, Armor Angling, Snapshot, Expert Gunner, and Clutch Braking. I don't have the last two slots, but I'd likely run something like Last Stand, and respecking Commander from the Quick Learner skill to something else once it's fully upgraded. Now onto equipment. For equipment I run the Ammo Swapper, the Loader, Gun Stabilizer, and also the Grousers to improve the hull rotation of the vehicle. As for my ammo setup, you'll see at the start of each battle I have 10 in each slot. 10 AP, 10 Heat, 10 HE. This is by far the most flexible build you can run for the 60 TP. For ammo, in which the ammo swapper is very crucial for with that 19-second reload. So, now that we got all the stats taken care of, on to how I play the vehicle. Usually I tend to brawl, playing it like a sort of Chieftain 705A hybrid, because it has the gun depression to work some ridges, not all, some ridges, but it also has the 750 Alpha that some of the bigger guns have, like the E100's gun. Plus your strong turret armor allows you to pretty effectively stay hull down and bounce a lot of shots, as you'll see in these 3 replays. Another special thing about the 60 GP, which it also shares with the Panther II and the Skoda T50 with its second gun, is that with the length of the gun, you can actually put your gun in the barrel of an enemy that you're close to, and it can block their shot because the gun is so big, which is helpful for blocking things like heat and HE. Another thing to note is that the upper plate is angled very far back. If you just finished on the 50 TP and are getting to the 60 TP, you'll be familiar with such an upper plate, as it's a similar concept, being that if you're face hugging someone who knows what they're doing, they can shoot down into your upper plate and pen you, since it's under 200 millimeters. From my experience, the ideal range ranges anywhere from 50 meters to 200 meters. Close combat, but not too close. Another thing to note is that the tracks are more prominent than the hull, meaning you'll get tracked very often, which is why you'll want to take some sort of track repair, whether it be track repair skill, or the general repair skill, or the repair equipment, or all 3. While the 60 TP is strong, I do suggest that you try to stay with at least an ally or 2, mainly heavies, since you want to be brawling, but not right up in the face. As with the ammo racks I mentioned earlier, you also want to try and avoid getting shot in the back of the turret. That is where your main ammo rack is, and if you get shot in the back of the turret, you will be ammo racked. With such a large gun and such a long reload time, being ammo racked is even worse than if you were in something with more DPM, making you more vulnerable after you shoot. Now for some comparison to its most closest counterparts. Starting with the Seasold P, the direct premium to the 60 TP. A few things are the same, such as the turret speed rotation, the hit points, as well as the gun stats like Alpha, Pen, module damage, and blast radius. Note that this is comparing without equipment to the 60 TP with equipment and skills. There are already a few things that are different, lacking 2 degrees of gun depression and 2 degrees of gun elevation, a better power to weight ratio, a longer base reload, faster shell speeds than the AP and the HE, with 2145 DPM base, and able to hold 4 more shells. However, it pays for this in a slightly worse armor, with a massive cupola on the back of the turret and less overall coverage of the thicker armor parts. While having slightly thicker set of armor overall, that thicker armor covers much less on the Seasold P than it does for the 60 TP. The Seasold suffers from the same ammo rack problem as the 60 TP does, but not quite as bad. If you shoot it in the back of the turret, it will also likely get ammo racked. Most of the ammo rack is down just beneath the back of the turret, slightly in the middle. The engine setup is very similar to the 60 TP, with most of it being in the back. However, there is a section on the left front of the hull making it slightly more vulnerable to being shot in the engine overall. As for a broad comparison between the Seazog and the 60TP, its main differences are in the armor, slightly in the shell velocity, and slightly in the mobility, otherwise being virtually the same tank, despite the shape and being premium. Now, naturally we'll move on to the BZYG for a comparison. So already, the base reload is shorter than that of the 60TPs with equipment and commander skills. However, the leverage for the 60TP is that it deals 750 alpha damage no matter the range. To do 750 alpha damage in the BZYG, you have to be at least 100 meters close to the enemy. Not to mention, both shells in the BZYG, the standard and the premium, are both APCR, meaning that you have a more likely chance to ricochet on something like an STRV, or really anything with the angled armor. Very slightly angled armor. As for the shells themselves, the BZYG gets 10 more shells than the 60GP does. However, as it does have slightly higher standard pen, being 13mm better at 263, it is ever so slightly worse pen on its premium rounds, being 314 compared to the 317 in 60TP, as well as losing 5mm of HE pen. While 85 is still good, it can be crucial every millimeter of HE pen. As for the gun, the BZYG is also more constrained, having 15 elevation and 7 depression. Less elevation than both the 60TP and the Seazog, but 1 degree more than the Seazog and 1 degree less than the 60TP. The turret and the hull turn at the same speed, that being 25 degrees a second base. The turret faster than both the Seazog and the 60TP, but the hull speed being slightly lower. The accuracy is also less of 0.40, and a whopping 3.19 on the move, which for reference is not too far off from something like the Sturmpanzer or the Sturm Tiger. Actual derp guns. This is not a derp gun, albeit it can be used for it due to the HE, but the 60TP would be better at that since it has the 152mm. BZYG also has an abysmal aiming time of 3 seconds, meaning you're very vulnerable while you're waiting to aim. Naturally, the shell velocity is much nicer than both the Seazog and the 60TP, with 1500 standard, 1800 premium, but the HE remains the same at that 900. The Seazog having 30 meters a second more than both the 60TP and the BZYG. However, despite having the 800 alpha within 50 meters, one thing the BZYG suffers from is long distance fights. While the 60TP is not ideal at 500 meters, it will be able to outtrade the BZYG at 500 meters significantly. Since at 500 meters the BZYG has 400 alpha, except on the HE. The HE remains the same, which is interesting. Something I have not seen yet. Although this is the first tank with the deep rifling mechanic in the game, so we'll have to see when they implement the Polish TD line. But back on topic, you would have the advantage at longer range with both a Seazog P and the 60TP, as well as any other heavy or tank destroyer, or even medium, that has more than 400 alpha and does not have the deep rifling mechanic. Now, compare the previous three with the VK72.01K, which also wields 750 alpha damage, also losing the 5mm of HE pen and 4mm less of AP pen on standard, but 334 on premium, making it better in terms of premium spam. So, right off the bat, it loses 100 hit points compared to the 60GP, as well as lower hull rotation speed and much lower turret rotation speed. with similar gun restraints as the BZYG, with 7 degrees of depression and 17 of elevation, with a 20-second base reload, and able to hold 35 shells. It also has the same 0.40 accuracy as the BZYG, and also keeping the 203 module damage. However, it pays for all of that through its ammo speed, 757 on standard and HE, and only 606 when the premium heat, making for quite the sluggish round, and the power to weight slightly higher than that of the 60GP. However, it goes slower at 33. It also has a 2.9 second aiming time, and 2.80 meters on the move accuracy, as well as 0.82 while the turret is turning. It has the same armor model as the Panzer VII, which is very, very outdated in this day and age, that of 2026, with the same over-angling weak spot in the side just below the turret. The armor is thick, but it's borderline useless due to this flaw, making it unable to do what it was designed to do. That is great, at least not reliably. Now to compare it to the Object 705A. The 705A lacks even more hit points at 2450, losing 150 hit points compared to the 60TP, as well as losing 100 alpha, however with the same caliber and a slightly better reload time at just under 17 seconds, although it pays for that with a 0.42 accuracy, which is very, very abysmal, but maintaining at 2.9 during movement, with a 2.7 second aiming time. The hull and the turret are also much slower, however it has a better power to weight, but naturally being Russian, it has 5 degrees of gun depression and 20 degrees of elevation, with slightly less AP pen, but identical premium and HE pen, and 2300 DPM, as well as having the same triple 900 meter a second shell speed, also going 38 kilometers an hour, which is faster than the 60GP. So, for the armor, the 705A also has the same problem as the CZP, as it has thicker armor, generally. However, it's more concentrated in one spot rather than all over the armor. The sides on the bottom are also the same thickness, that being behind the tracks and the angled part, while the back is more susceptible at 60 millimeters. Again, the same problem with the ammo racks, as there's a big chunk in the turret. However, it's not as big of a problem as with 3 Polish heavies we were talking about earlier. However, there are 2 massive ones right underneath the turret. The engine is in the front and also smaller than that of the Polish heavies. Now to compare it to the E100 at the big gun, which is the same gun on the VK72.01K, meaning that all the gun statistics are likely similar. A slight change in accuracy or DPM at best. 7 degrees of depression and 20 degrees of elevation, making it similar to the rest of the heavies we've been looking at. It's more sluggish, going 30 forward and 15 backward, however having a comparable power to weight, and having 200 more hit points on top of that. However, both the turret and the hull being 22 degrees a second are also much slower. As most players or tanks know, E100 has very reputable armor. However, I would argue that the 60GP has a better armor layout due to it having more rounded armor than the E100 does, not having such a boxy shape in comparison. The armor, although thick, needs to be angled precisely. The side armor is naturally thicker, since this is a super heavy, with 60mm spaced on top of that, and a whopping 150mm in the back, as well as on the back and sides of the turret, as well as the lower plate, all 150mm, and even the top bar. The E100 does not very much have the same ammo rack problem. However, it does have the majority of its ammo rack in the turret, meaning at the same time, if it gets shot in the backside of the turret, it will probably be ammo racked, similar to that of the 60TP. Now to compare it to the BZ-75, with 100 less hit points and 30 top speed. A faster hull rotation, but a slower turret rotate. Very similar gun depression and elevation at 8 degrees of depression and 20 degrees of elevation. Lacking 100 alpha, but also having a 152mm caliber, with 1,150 meters a second on the AP, 950 meters a second on the heat, and 860 on the HE. With the same HE pen, slightly more AP pen, and slightly more heat pen, and a 1 second longer reload on the 60 TP compared to the BZ-75. However, the same ammo capacity, and generally better power to weight. Again, same problem with the armor, being that it's thicker, generally. However, it's more concentrated in certain areas rather than spread out throughout the armor. However, the sides are thicker at 110mm, but just like the 705A, only 60mm in the back, and 165 on the side of the turret. It also has the same ammunition problem, most of it being in the back of the turret and below the turret, and a bigger chunk in the engine being in the back. As to my knowledge, those are the best comparisons for the 60GP, not including the Type 5, because that is not exactly the same type of vehicle. While yes, still a different type of heavy. Literally. Type. Get it? Type 5. Okay, yeah, whatever. Overall, I would say that the 60TP is one of the most flexible Tier 10 heavies with 750 alpha damage base being standard. And as you can see in these replays, I'm using it very effectively to rack up damage quickly, having brutally traded with a Death Star and brutally murdered a Rogue Ladorn. So, in the grand scheme of things, do I think that 60TP is the greatest high alpha heavy tank at tier 10? No, I wouldn't say that, but it's very proficient at its job, being capable of doing thousands upon thousands of damage if needed and if played properly. I stress that a lot because I struggle with it myself after getting the 60TP first. It's a learning curve. Once you learn the niche differences between the 60TP and other heavies, which you will put to good use. Especially since at one point, I used to call it the 60 toilet paper, because I did not know how to use it, and I kept failing over and over and over, not doing more than 1,000 damage at a time, until eventually I figured it out, I learned its intricacies, and I began getting games like I'm showing you now. Pumping out damage, effectively trading with other heavies, using my unique armor layout, and training myself to effectively use the 20-second reload to my advantage. Not always is that the tank that wins you the battle, but more times than likely, it's the player. That's all I have for you today. There's a few more minutes in the replay, so I'm going to let it play out. Let you watch that till the end of this third game here. But that was my in-depth review on the 60TP, one of my very first tier 10 heavies I ever got to in the technique. It might even have been the first, I don't quite remember. But if you like niche tanks and you like high alpha, I suggest you grind up the Polish heavy line. Because not only is the tier 10 fun, but the whole line actually works like the tier 10 does. Not nearly as effective, but a similar fashion. Not quite hull down, not quite heavy hitting in all the aspects, because unlike tier 10, you can be bottom tier. However, generally against your own tier, it works similar. But I'm gonna stop rambling. This has been Rook. I hope you all get good RNG. I'll catch you on the flip side. Peace. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the algorithm. I beg.